And that satisfies Congress. And, it wasn't a concern for the Bush administration because they haven't been impeded by the law for a long time. But for instance, the Pentagon has got a counterintelligence field activity program that's out there covertly gathering information on Americans who protest against the Iraq War or who are involved with websites that are critical of U.S. military policy. I was talking to Don Rumsfeld about this last week, and he said that FFF is not on the list. So, people don't need to worry about that. But the Pentagon has carried out scores of surveillance of a lot of anti-war protests and gatherings, including one at a Quaker meeting house in Florida. Names of people who go to these kind of things are added to a Pentagon database which involves terrorism threat warnings. And this is something which would be on your permanent federal record. And folks might have this notion that, well, but there's due process, this information would not be used against me. It's fine to have a healthy fantasy life, but, these are not the rules that the government plays by. And the federal law is less and less of an impediment to the Bush administration every year. Something we learned in late 2005 was that the National Security Agency had conducted thousands of warrantless wiretaps on Americans. This is something that the New York Times was told about a month or two before the 2004 election, but they chose not to publish it, and therefore the New York Times may have gotten Bush a second term because they were basically cowardly on this. But during the 1970s, there were horrendous abuses of the federal government doing wiretaps on Americans for supposedly national security reasons. There were White House aides. I think Bill Safire was wiretapped. Henry Kissinger had him tapped. There were no limits on this. It was simply up to the president to decide who would be tapped. Congress recognized that there were horrendous abuses there. There was a law passed in 1978 called the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, which makes it a crime to do a wiretap without a warrant. It could be a warrant from a secret court, this FISA court, which is pretty much of a joke because it simply rubber stamps almost everything the government asks for, but there is at least some record there. But the Bush administration decided that even seeking a warrant was a violation of his dignity, and that the president had his own inherent authority to order wiretaps of Americans' phone calls. This is the very clear doctrine that Bush lawyers have established. It's something that Alberto Gonzales referred to as the commander-in-chief override. And so basically you have the entire U.S. Constitution. Well, that's a technicality because George Bush has to protect America. And that has been their attitude on almost, on many areas. And the type of wiretaps that they're doing, the feds have we don't know who they're wiretapping. And Congress has not shown a lot of, curiosity. But these are the type of scandals which tend to snowball. I mean, things are probably a hell of a lot worse than what they seem, because that has been the pattern for every type of Bush violation of law so far. Something which came out last May was that the feds have been doing call tracking for millions of Americans. The feds have been tracking every number which a person would call or be called by, and creating these massive data warehouses. This is completely illegal under a 1986 federal law. But the feds have just kind of shrugged that off, and they haven't worried about that. Now, it's interesting what the rule of law has become, because there were a lot of concerns in the Justice Department about whether these secret wiretaps were illegal. But during the time Ashcroft was Attorney General, it basically got rubber stamped every time. And the Bush administration's attitude was that if the Justice Department said it was legal, there was no need to go to a court. I mean, it was self-evident that it was legal. There was a glitch one time because the program was expiring, and Ashcroft was in the hospital after having some kind of, was it gallbladder or something like that, and he wasn't really that conscious. But it was necessary for him to certify that the program was in compliance with the law or else it would look like Bush and his team were breaking the law. So you had Andrew Card, the White House chief of staff, and Gonzales raced over to Ashcroft's hospital room to pressure him to sign this waiver of federal law to let them keep on wiretapping. Well, as a former Deputy Attorney General Comey testified a few weeks ago, he heard that they were on the way, and he raced there to Ashcroft's hospital bed. You know, it had to be a hell of a scene, you know, because, you know, John Ashcroft didn't make much sense when he was sober, you know. And to think of John Ashcroft, you know, kind of zoned out on painkillers, and then, you know, I mean, to have the White House chief of staff and the, you know, and Gonzales, who's, I've always had a lot of respect for his scholarship on the law. You know, to have those guys by Ashcroft's hospital bed, and Comey there is arguing, and Bob Mueller apparently came and supported Comey, and, you know, and so they were not able to get this certified as being legal, but Bush said, well, on a temporary basis, just keep doing it on my authority. You know, there was, people were concerned about this in the Justice Department, and a investigation was launched early last year on this. But George Bush scuttled the investigation. It was looking at whether Gonzales, as a White House counsel, and Bush, primarily Gonzales, but with Bush's approval, whether they had violated federal law with this warrantless wiretapping. But George Bush effectively scuttled that investigation. Now, this was in the papers briefly. If you think back to the early 1970s, Nixon did some similar things, and people got really upset. But for some reason, this is rolled off people's back like water off a duck's back. The news media has chosen to make very little hubbub over this. But it looks like a very clear case of a president, you know, basically sculling an investigation into his own criminality. At some point, you know, there's got to be a conflict of interest there. Now, the thing with the wiretaps, this is something which plays into a lot of the other stuff the Bush administration is doing. There was a provision in the Patriot Act which greatly expanded the FBI's authority to use national security letters. And a national security letter is simply an FBI subpoena, but it has the force of law. I mean, it's something which and not only that, but it's the legal equivalent of an FBI going in there and holding a, you know, holding a sword over somebody's head, because someone who receives one of these national security letters is prohibited from telling anybody. They were even prohibited from telling their lawyer up until very recently. And the, you know, the Bush team said, well, this is not really a problem because these are things which were being used very rarely. Well, they lied. It turns out the FBI was issuing at least 30,000 national security letters a year. And these are 30,000 warrantless searches. These are under supervision of no judge. I mean, it's simply, you know, it's simply some FBI office, you know, asking, so, well, you know, shall we search this guy's records? And they say, yeah, okay, fine. That's due process with these national security letters. And as the Washington Post noted, these letters empower the FBI to seize records that show where a person makes and spends money, with whom he lives and lived before, how much he gambles, what he buys online, where he travels, how he invests, what he searches for and reads on the web, and who telephones or emails him at home or work. And there is no need for a warrant for this because it's on the FBI's own authority. And each national security letter can lasso the personal records of thousands of people. So the 30,000 is a very low number. For instance, in late 2003 and early 2004, the FBI used national security letters to seize personal data on almost 1 million people who visited Las Vegas around New Year's. And once again, there was no need, no need to even talk to a judge. It was the FBI going to these hotels and casinos and other entities out there and just kind of saying, you know, give us the information or, you know, very bad things will happen.